March 6, 1944. 28,000 feet above Berlin. Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, then opened them again. The contrails were still there. Long white streaks scratching across the Prussian blue sky, coming from the west. His gloved hand tightened on the control column of his Focke-Wulf FW-190 as he keyed his radio. Achtung, Rottenführer, amerikanische Jäger, Vector 270. The response crackled back immediately, tinged with disbelief. Herr Hauptmann, that cannot be correct. No American fighter has the range to... I know what I'm seeing, Lieutenant. Dietrich's voice cut through the static. They're here. For 2 years, the Luftwaffe had operated with a fundamental assumption. Allied fighters couldn't follow their bombers deep into the Reich. The Americans would send their lumbering B-17 Fortresses and B-24 Liberators in massive formations, and German fighters would tear into them like wolves among sheep once the short-ranged P-47 Thunderbolts turned back at the border. It was a mathematics of fuel and distance that had always favored the defenders. Until now. Dietrich rolled his aircraft, bringing the nose around as his Schwarm, his four-fighter element, moved into combat formation. Below them, hundreds of American bombers droned toward Berlin's industrial districts, their contrails weaving a geometric pattern across the sky. And above those bombers, where there should have been empty air, sleek silver fighters carved through the thin atmosphere, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even at this distance. P-51 Mustangs, over Berlin. It shouldn't be possible. 6 months earlier, intelligence reports had mentioned the new American fighter with bemused dismissal. The Mustang had entered service with the RAF in 1942 as a low-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, powered by an Allison engine that wheezed and struggled above 15,000 feet. Luftwaffe pilots who encountered it found it unremarkable. Fast in level flight, perhaps, but no match for the Bf-109 or FW-190 in combat. The Americans had taken the same aircraft, fitted British Merlin engines to improve high-altitude performance, and deployed it to their 8th Air Force bases in England. Even then, the Mustang remained what it had always been, a short-range fighter bound by the same tyranny of fuel consumption that limited every piston-engine aircraft, or so they'd thought. Dietrich had heard whispers in the ready room at Doberitz Airfield 3 weeks prior. A pilot from Jagdgeschwader. 3 claimed to have spotted Mustangs far beyond their supposed operational radius. The man had been drinking, and his story was dismissed as confusion or fabrication. After all, the physics were simple. Fighters carried less fuel than bombers, and their high-performance engines consumed it voraciously. The P-47 Thunderbolt could barely make it to the German border and back. The Mustang was lighter, but not that much lighter. The idea that it could escort bombers to Berlin and have fuel remaining for combat was absurd. Yet here they were, silver cruciform shapes weaving lazy figure eights above the bomber stream, 300 miles from their bases in England. Schwarm, prepare to engage. Dietrich's thumb moved to the weapons selector, arming his 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. His wingman, Feldwebel Hans Kruger, tucked in tight on his right. The young pilot's aircraft so close, Dietrich could see his white knuckles gripping the stick. On his left, Oberleutnant Werner Schröder and Unteroffizier Paul Beck completed the formation, 4 Predators moving as one. They had the altitude advantage, diving from 28,000 feet toward the American fighters at 24,000. The sun was behind them. Every tactical consideration favored the Luftwaffe pilots. Men with 2, 3, sometimes 4 years of combat experience. Flying aircraft they knew intimately. The Americans were newcomers, their pilots fresh from training schools in Texas and Arizona, flying an untested long-range configuration. Dietrich nosed over, feeling the FW-190 accelerate as gravity added velocity to engine power. His airspeed indicator climbed past 400 kilometers per hour, then 500. The silver Mustangs grew larger in his windscreen, and he selected the nearest target, A fighter flying loose cover on the bomber formation's northern flank. At 800 meters, he could see the aircraft's details. The bubble canopy, the shark-like air intake beneath the nose, the external fuel tanks slung beneath each wing. Drop tanks. That was the answer then. The Americans had solved the range problem, not with magic, but with expendable fuel containers. It was elegant in its simplicity, and Dietrich felt a cold knot form in his stomach as the implications crystallized. If they could reach Berlin, they could reach anywhere. The sanctuary of distance that had protected German industry for 3 years had just evaporated. At 600 meters, the Mustang pilot saw them coming. The American fighter snapped into a hard left turn, jettisoning both drop tanks in a spray of mist as residual fuel atomized in the freezing air. Dietrich watched the silver aircraft pivot, tighter than he'd anticipated, the Mustang's wingspan catching the morning sun as it reversed toward him. He adjusted his deflection, leading the turn, finger tightening on the trigger. Then the Mustang accelerated. Not the lazy acceleration of an aircraft already at combat speed, but a surge of power that opened the distance between them even as Dietrich held his dive. His FW-190, already pushing 550 kilometers per hour, was being outrun. He fired anyway, a 2-second burst that sent 20mm shells arcing through empty air where the Mustang had been a heartbeat before. Scheisse! The curse escaped before he could stop it. Dietrich pulled hard on the stick, hauling the Focke-Wulf through a punishing turn that grayed his vision at the edges. 4,000 feet below, the bomber stream continued its relentless progression toward Berlin, while around him the sky erupted into chaos. Schroeder's voice crackled over the radio, strained with G-forces. "He's faster than my 190. How is he—" The transmission cut off as the Oberleutnant broke hard right, a Mustang sliding into his 6 o'clock with methodical precision. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The intelligence reports had mentioned the Mustang's speed. It was fast. Everyone knew that. But speed meant nothing if you couldn't catch the enemy, and catching required endurance. The whole point was that American fighters would arrive over the target area already low on fuel, forced to conserve energy for the return flight, vulnerable to aggressive tactics from defenders operating close to their bases with full tanks. Except these Mustangs weren't acting like aircraft at the end of their operational radius. They fought like they had fuel to burn. Dietrich reversed his turn, searching for Kruger. His wingman was 2 kilometers away, locked in a climbing spiral with another Mustang, both aircraft clawing for altitude in the thin air. The American pilot matched Kruger turn for turn, and at 30,000 feet, where the FW-190's performance should have been dominant, the Mustang hung in the vertical with its nose pointed skyward, still accelerating. "Brake left! Brake left!" Beck's panicked shout filled Dietrich's headset. He craned his neck, searching for the threat, and found it. A Mustang dropping from above, perfectly positioned. The shark's mouth painted on its nose, making it look like it was grinning, as tracer rounds stitched the air where Beck's aircraft had been. The Unterofficier's FW-190 snap-rolled right, then dove, trading altitude for speed in the classic defensive maneuver. The Mustang followed, matching the dive, staying glued to Beck's tail through every desperate turn and reversal. Dietrich pushed his throttle to the firewall and angled to intercept. But even at full power, he couldn't close the distance fast enough. Below 20,000 feet, Beck pulled out of his dive and went to full throttle, running for his life. The FW-190 was fast at low altitude, one of its strengths. But the Mustang stayed with him, actually gaining ground. Dietrich watched in disbelief as the American fighter closed from 400 meters to 300, then 250, its nose steady, the pilot waiting for the perfect shot. When it came, it was surgical. A 3-second burst, the tracers converging on Beck's left wing root. Cannon shells. The Americans had finally learned to mount cannons instead of relying solely on machine guns, tore through aluminum and struck something vital. Flame bloomed orange against the grey-white landscape below, and Beck's aircraft began a slow, lazy roll to the left. "Raus! Raus!" Dietrich shouted into his radio, knowing it was futile. Beck was already gone, probably dead from that first burst. The FW-190 continued its death spiral, trailing black smoke, until it disappeared into the scattered clouds at 8,000 feet. 1 minute of combat, one experienced pilot dead, and the bombers hadn't even reached their target yet. Dietrich pulled up hard, gaining altitude, trying to reorganize his scattered swarm. Kruger was still fighting his vertical duel at 31,000 feet, the contrails from both aircraft drawing spirals against the blue. Schroeder had shaken his pursuer and was climbing back to rejoin formation. And everywhere Dietrich looked, the same scene repeated itself. Luftwaffe fighters engaging, breaking off, engaging again, while the Mustangs maintained their protective orbit over the bombers with what seemed like inexhaustible endurance. At 26,000 feet, Dietrich leveled off and took stock. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 remaining, plenty for another 30 minutes of combat and the short flight back to Doberitz. He should have every advantage, fighting over home territory, close to his base, able to land, rearm, and rejoin the battle. The Americans were supposed to be the ones watching their fuel gauges, calculating whether they had enough to make it back to England. But as he watched, another swarm from JG-26 attempt a diving attack on the bomber stream, only to be intercepted by Mustangs that somehow had the speed to climb back to altitude afterward. Dietrich understood that something fundamental had changed in the mathematics of aerial warfare. A new voice crackled over the radio, older, authoritative. Major Heinz Baer, the Geschwader Commodore, calling from his command aircraft. All units, break contact. Repeat, all units break contact and reform at Rally Point Anton. We're burning fuel fighting escorts. Let them go. Hit the bombers on the return leg when they're alone. Except they wouldn't be alone, Dietrich thought. Not anymore. These Mustangs would still be there on the return leg, still escorting, still fighting, still somehow having enough fuel to make it back across Germany, across occupied France, across the English Channel to their bases. He keyed his radio. Rottenführer, acknowledge. Form on me. Schroeder appeared on his left wing 30 seconds later, his aircraft showing scorch marks along the fuselage where bullets had passed too close. Kruger descended from above, his starboard aileron torn, fabric flapping in the slipstream. 3 aircraft where there had been 4. Below them, the bomber stream continued toward Berlin, and above the bombers, the silver Mustangs circled like patient sharks, waiting. Dietrich landed at Doberitz 40 minutes later, his FW-190's wheels kissing the concrete runway as ground crew rushed forward with fuel trucks and ammunition carts. The engine coughed twice before settling into idle, and he sat in the cockpit for a moment, hands still trembling slightly, watching mechanics swarm over the aircraft. Through his canopy, he could see other fighters returning, some trailing smoke, others with visible battle damage. One landing gear up in the grass beside the runway in a shower of sparks. The ready room smelled of cigarette smoke, coffee, and sweat. Pilots clustered around the situation map, their voices rising in heated debate. Someone had already marked the American penetration route with red grease pencil, a line that stabbed deep into the Reich's heart. Something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. They stayed for 20 minutes over the target. Hauptmann Georg Eder from 2 Gruppe jabbed a finger at the map. 20 minutes. We broke contact. They escorted the bombers through the flak, and they still had fuel to engage us on the egress. I saw 3 separate Mustangs attack my staffel during the withdrawal. They should have been running on fumes. Major Baer stood at the front of the room, his face carved from stone, listening. He was an ace with over 200 kills, a veteran of Spain, Poland, France, Russia, and now the defense of the Reich. He had flown against every Allied fighter type, knew their strengths and weaknesses, had developed tactics to counter each one. But now, as pilot after pilot reported the same impossible endurance from the Mustangs, Dietrich could see something in the Major's expression he'd never seen before. Uncertainty. Fuel calculations, Baer said finally, cutting through the chaos. Someone get me the intelligence file on the P-51D. Range, fuel capacity, consumption rates. Now. A young lieutenant, Dietrich didn't know his name, hurried to the filing cabinets and returned with a folder stamped with the Abwehr seal. Bear opened it, scanned the pages, and his jaw tightened. Internal fuel, 269 gallons. Range with internal fuel, approximately 750 miles. He looked up. England to Berlin is 580 miles. They should be landing on fumes after one low-intensity engagement, let alone sustained combat. The drop tanks, Schroeder said from the corner where he was lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. They had drop tanks. I saw them jettison them before engaging. Bear nodded slowly. Yes. The file mentions provisions for external fuel storage, but it doesn't specify capacity. He flipped through more pages. There's a note here from an interrogation of a downed P-47 pilot 2 months ago. He mentioned the Americans were experimenting with larger external tanks. 108 gallons. Some units were testing 150-gallon tanks. The room went quiet as the implications settled over them like ash. Mein Gott, someone whispered. With 150-gallon drop tanks, 300 gallons total in 2 tanks, plus the 269 gallons internal, the Mustang would carry 569 gallons of fuel. Enough to fly to Berlin and back with reserves for sustained combat. The Americans had taken a fighter with already impressive range and nearly doubled it. They'd turned a tactical interceptor into a strategic escort fighter capable of going anywhere the bombers went. Dietrich moved to the window, looking out at the flight line where ground crews worked frantically to repair and rearm aircraft. Beyond the airfield, columns of smoke rose from Berlin's industrial districts where the Americans had dropped their bombs, unopposed at the critical moment because the Luftwaffe had been too busy fighting escorts that shouldn't have existed. The telephone on Bear's desk rang. He answered it, listened, and his expression darkened further. When he hung up, he addressed the room. That was Luftwaffe Reich headquarters. Today's raid involved 672 heavy bombers escorted by 801 fighters. Of those fighters, 238 were P-51 Mustangs flying from bases in England and East Anglia. They engaged our forces over Berlin, Magdeburg, and Brunswick. We lost 47 aircraft. The Americans lost 11 bombers and 5 fighters. 47 German aircraft. 11 American bombers. The mathematics were catastrophic. Gentlemen, Bear continued, his voice measured but hard. We have been operating under a strategic assumption that is no longer valid. For 3 years, we have relied on range limitations to dictate the terms of engagement. We chose when and where to attack bomber formations. We conserved fuel for multiple sorties. We had sanctuary in depth. He paused, letting his words sink in. As of today, that sanctuary no longer exists. The Americans can now escort their bombers to any target in Germany. Berlin, Munich, the Ruhr, the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the aircraft factories we've dispersed to the countryside. Nothing is beyond their reach. And the P-51 is not just a long-range ferry aircraft. It's a fighter that matches or exceeds our best aircraft in speed, climb rate, and turning performance at altitude. Dietrich thought of Beck's FW-190 tumbling from the sky, flames streaming. He thought of the Mustang pilot who had shot him down, the methodical precision of the attack, the patient stalking, the calculated burst. That pilot had been fighting 300 miles from his base and had flown as though fuel was infinite. "What are our orders, Herr Major?" Ida asked. Bear walked to the map and studied the red line marking the American penetration route. "We adapt. We've done it before. When the RAF switched to night bombing, when the Americans started flying in formation boxes, when they began using the Norden bombsight. We learn, we adjust, and we continue to defend the fatherland." But even as he said it, Dietrich heard the hollowness in the words. Adaptation required time and resources. It required numerical superiority or technological advantage. The Luftwaffe was being ground down in a war of attrition over its own territory, losing experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced, Aircraft production was shifting underground to avoid bombing. Fuel supplies were dwindling. And now, the one advantage they'd retained, the ability to choose when and where to fight, had been taken away by a simple innovation: a bigger fuel tank. Outside, the air raid sirens began to wail again. A second wave, or perhaps a diversionary raid in another sector. Through the window, Dietrich watched pilots run for their aircraft, ground crews yanking fuel hoses free and slamming ammunition hatches closed. The afternoon sun glinted off the canopies of FW-190s and BF-109s as they taxied toward the runway, rolling out to meet another formation of bombers escorted by fighters that could follow them anywhere. Schroeder appeared at his shoulder, watching the same scene. "They were joking about the Mustang in the mess hall last month," he said quietly. "Called it the spam can. Said it was just another American aircraft with a British engine. Nothing to worry about." Dietrich nodded, remembering. The dismissiveness had been pervasive, an arrogance born from years of qualitative superiority. The Luftwaffe had fielded the first jet fighter, had developed rocket interceptors, had pioneered tactical innovations that other air forces copied. The idea that the Americans could simply bolt bigger fuel tanks onto an existing airframe and fundamentally change the strategic balance had seemed too prosaic to take seriously. "We weren't joking today," Dietrich said. The first fighter lifted off, followed by another, then another, climbing into the afternoon sky to face an enemy that would be waiting over the target, and would still be waiting on the return flight, and would make it home to England while German pilots calculated fuel margins and landing weights, and hoped their engines wouldn't quit on approach. Bear's voice called from across the room. "Dietrich, your Schwarm is back on the rotation board. You launch in 30 minutes. Jawohl, Herr Major." He turned from the window and walked to the equipment locker, pulling out his parachute harness, his flight gloves, his maps. Through the ready room window, the sky looked deceptively peaceful. Clear blue stretching to the horizon, with only the contrails to mark where men were dying at 25,000 feet. The joke was over. The P-51 Mustang had appeared over Berlin, and nothing would ever be the same. The Americans would be back tomorrow, and the day after, and every clear day thereafter, their silver fighters ranging across Germany with impunity, turning the vast distances that had once protected the Reich into a killing ground with no refuge. Dietrich buckled his harness and headed for the flight line, where his aircraft waited with a fresh load of ammunition and a full tank of fuel that would last for 90 minutes of flight time.